I stand in support of this opposition motion, this New Democratic Party motion, Mr. Speaker. I don't usually read out the whole motion. When it's a long one, Mr. Speaker, it takes up precious speaking time, but I will in this case, because I still find it hard to believe, we're actually debating it, that this subject is actually up for debate in the House of Commons. The motion reads, Mr. Speaker, that, in the opinion of the House, a standalone covenant of moral, social, and legal fiduciary obligation exists between the Canadian people and the government to provide financial compensation and support services to past and active members of the Canadian Armed Forces who have been injured, disabled, or have died as a result of military service, and to their dependents, which this government is obligated to fulfill. Hard to believe, Mr. Speaker, that we have to dedicate an opposition day, that we have to dedicate a day to debate what should be a no-brainer, what should be common sense, common Canadian sense, Mr. Speaker. Our veterans stood on guard for us, Mr. Speaker. They stood on guard for Canada. Our veterans stood on guard for democracy. They stood on guard around the world in conflict zones like Iraq, Afghanistan, Bosnia, Libya. They stood on guard for us in humanitarian missions like Haiti after the earthquake in January 2010, and in Newfoundland and Labrador after Hurricane Igor that same year. Our veterans stood on guard for us, Mr. Speaker, and we must stand on guard for them. That is the essence of the sacred covenant that exists between the Government of Canada and our armed forces. Our responsibility, our duty, Mr. Speaker, is to be there for soldiers and veterans in their moment of need, not to abandon them to budget and service cuts. I call that, Mr. Speaker, the ultimate insult. Too many give the ultimate sacrifice, and this government gives the ultimate insult. There have been too many examples, Mr. Speaker, where this Conservative government has failed to stand on guard for our veterans, Mr. Speaker. Now, the NDP MP for Sackville Eastern Shore in Nova Scotia, he just spoke, Mr. Speaker. This party's Veterans Affairs critic, and an outstanding critic he is, Mr. Speaker. The MP for Sackville Eastern Shore has a quote on his office door from a U.S. senator. And the quote is this, Mr. Speaker: "If you cannot afford to take care of your veterans, then don't go to war." If you can't afford to take care of your veterans, then don't go to war. Mr. Speaker, this Conservative government has not been taking care of our veterans. It wasn't taking care of our veterans, Mr. Speaker, when it closed 9 Veterans Affairs offices across Canada, including one in Corner Brook, Newfoundland, my home province. I was told just today, Mr. Speaker, of a Newfoundland veteran who served in Bosnia. Now, he had to drive 8 hours from Corner Brook, his home, to St. John's, the closest office, so that the staff there could start a profile on him. 8 hours across the island of Newfoundland, Mr. Speaker. This Conservative government wasn't taking care of veterans, Mr. Speaker, when it cut 23% of the Veterans Affairs workforce, or 900 jobs, since 2009. This Conservative government certainly wasn't taking care of veterans, Mr. Speaker, when it spent more than $700,000 fighting Afghan veterans in court to deny the existence of the social covenant I mentioned a moment ago. Lawyers for this government have argued that it has no obligation or social contract with veterans, Mr. Speaker. Those same lawyers also argued that it is unfair to bind the current government to promises made nearly a century ago by another prime minister. Mr. Speaker, that social contract was struck in 1917 by then Conservative Prime Minister Robert Borden. Quote, "The government and the country will consider it their first duty to see that a proper appreciation of your effort and of your courage is brought to the notice of people at home, and no man, whether he goes back or whether he remains in Flanders, will have just cause to reproach the government for having broken faith with the men who won and the men who died." Now, Mr. Speaker, not only hasn't this Conservative government failed to take care of our veterans, Mr. Speaker, to respect that sacred covenant, it has also been playing the worst sort of politics, Mr. Speaker, the sort of politics that rots faith in our political system. Now, the latest massive omnibus bill, Bill C-59, is the Budget Implementation Bill, Mr. Speaker. It is 167 pages, Mr. Speaker, which is short by omnibus standards, and it obviously includes, measures on the budget. Now, that's the same boutique budget that we will be voting against, Mr. Speaker, because it caters to the wealthy, among other reasons. It puts the needs of the more affluent, the more influential, first, Mr. Speaker. But this bill, Bill C-59, contains more than this year's budget measures. Much, much more, Mr. Speaker. The bill touches on almost 24 other bills, from the Federal Balanced Budget Act and the Prevention of Terrorist Travel Act to public service sick leave and Canadian Labor Code changes. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives have also cynically included provisions to assist veterans in that omnibus bill. Now, such a move, and they do this all the time, Mr. Speaker, will force opposition parties who support those measures to help veterans to vote against the bill. And then, and you can take this to the bank, Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives will throw it in our faces how we voted against veterans. Now, that's the kind of government we have in power, Mr. Speaker, a government that's morally spent. Now, I can get much more creative, Mr. Speaker, definitely get much more creative, but I don't want to cross the parliamentary line. After 9 years of Conservative government, Mr. Speaker, too many veterans and their families cannot access adequate health care, pensions, and other vital supports. Mr. Speaker, I had a conversation just this morning with Jamie McWhirter. Now, he's a Newfoundlander. He's also a veteran. Now, Jamie McWhirter, he survived a 7-month tour in Afghanistan's most volatile war zones. He survived, Mr. Speaker. He drove a refueling truck loaded with 10,000 liters of diesel, and his nickname, Mr. Speaker, was Fireball, for obvious reasons. Now, near misses for Jamie included rocket attacks, the horror of a suicide bombing that killed several children, firefights, and roadside bombs. So, Mr. Speaker, Jamie McWhirter survived Afghanistan in one piece, only to battle a different type of nightmare back here in Canada, in Newfoundland and Labrador, Mr. Speaker. Jamie McWhirter has post-traumatic stress disorder, and the battle here at home was, and still is, for help. Jamie McWhirter says there is some help for veterans, Mr. Speaker, some services available, but too often veterans don't know about them, Mr. Speaker. Too often soldiers are afraid to speak out for fear of being kicked out of the military. They're afraid to ask for help. Soldiers don't feel safe in asking for help, Mr. Speaker, and when they do, too often the help is not there. Now, Mr. Speaker, Jamie McWhirter and others have formed a support group, PTS Buddies, to help people with post-traumatic stress disorder. That's the name of their group, Mr. Speaker, PTSD Buddies. And to help them share experiences and to lean on each other for support. Now, Mr. Speaker, veterans should lean on each other. It's good that they're coming together to support each other. That's what soldiers, the best kind of soldiers, do, Mr. Speaker. But veterans should also be able to lean on their own government, Mr. Speaker. Now, I mentioned earlier, Mr. Speaker, how this Conservative government is fighting Afghan vets in court to deny the existence of the Social Covenant. Now, those vets are in a group called Equitas Society, and I have a quote from that group, Mr. Speaker, quote, "A veteran, whether regular or reserve, active or retired, is someone who at one point in their life wrote a blank check made payable to the Government of Canada for an amount of up to and including their life." Now, a blank check to the government for an amount of up to and including their life. Mr. Speaker, 158 Canadians were killed in combat in Afghanistan. And I say this with great respect to their families, Mr. Speaker, for the loved ones they left behind. Even more personnel, an estimated 160, have died from suicide since returning home from Afghanistan. And Mr. Speaker, the Government of Canada has a sacred obligation as the holder of that blank check to stand and deliver, to stand on guard for the men and women of our forces when they ask for help. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Dauphin Swan River Marquette.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and the hypocrisy from the member opposite is almost too much to bear, but I steeled myself and listened to it. The NDP have a very strong anti-military history, and this phony concern for veterans shines through and through. They have never supported any military action to defend democracy anywhere around the world, including the fight against ISIS. Shamefully, they are opposing Canada's participation in protecting and defending Western democracies, and that is shameful, Mr. Speaker. In fact, that anti-military legacy started with the founder of their party, J.S. Woodsworth, who actually opposed Canada's participation in the Second World War. Can you imagine what the world would have been like if his advice had been followed? Vladimir Lenin called the Western left useful idiots for keeping him in power. Why is the NDP so anti-military and not willing to protect and defend democracy?
Honourable Member for St. John's South Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, usually when I get asked a question after a speech, I thank the honourable member, but I'm not going to thank that honourable member, Mr. Speaker. Too often what he says in this House of Commons, Mr. Speaker, either makes no sense or is just an affront to everything I hold dear about this House, Mr. Speaker. Now, one of the things that the honourable members just said, Mr. Speaker, was that hypocrisy is too much to bear, and he talked about how the New Democrats, how we never support a military action. I can tell you this, Mr. Speaker, the perspective of a Newfoundlander and Labradorian. I'm a Newfoundlander, Mr. Speaker. We have had more Newfoundlanders per capita serve in the Canadian Navy and the Canadian military than any other province or territory in this country, Mr. Speaker. I can tell you a great quote. He gave a quote. I'll give you another quote. Winston Churchill in the Second World War, Mr. Speaker. He called Newfoundlanders the best small boatsmen in the world, and he was right. He was right, Mr. Speaker. We are that. We have given more than our share to military conflicts Newfoundland and Labrador has, Mr. Speaker. Hypocrisy.
Questions and comments. Question commentaire. The Honourable Member for Bonavista Gander, Grand Falls, Windsor.
Full of what, sorry? Oh, sorry. I was listening to the exchange. I won't comment on the exchange you just heard, but I would like to also offer a quote into this debate what my honourable colleague from St. John South Mount Pearl brought up, and that's from Jamie McWhirter, once again, from PTSD Buddies. There have been several in the group, and they've been very proactive in the media for reasons that are obvious. And I want to quote from him when he says, so I thought if I could just get these people together, we would learn from each other and move forward with our lives. Now, anybody suffering from distress will use that method to get the same people together, talk about how they're coping with it, share best practices, and so on and so forth. And I agree with that. But what has happened here is that functionally, by closing the offices, these offices have the capacity by which to deal with these people. They are on the front lines, if I could use that term. And for people like Jamie McWhirter and PTSD Buddies, I want my colleague to comment on how much more difficult it is that these specialized services have disappeared, especially Newfoundland and Labrador, pertaining to the office in Corner Brook.
Honourable Member for St. John South Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member. I mean honourable when I say that, Mr. Speaker, for the question. In terms of the new group, PTS Buddies, that has formed in Newfoundland, a group made up of veterans who come together to support each other, I think that what they're doing is fabulous, and veterans should be able to lean each other. One of the central points in the speech I just gave, Mr. Speaker, is how, besides leaning on each other, they should also be able to lean on the Government of Canada. But too often, and I gave numerous examples in my speech, Mr. Speaker, they can't rely on, they can't lean on the Government of Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
And we have time for one more short question. The Honourable Member for Hamilton East, Stony Creek.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'll try to be brief. I personally suffer from PTSD for over 40 years. I was a signal maintainer on the railway, and I had 4 accidents where people driving cars were hit, and they and the car were completely destroyed. For 40 years, I've had dreams about this. Now, it was back in a time where this wasn't a diagnosed illness for anybody. And to say that our young men who go into war, who do horrible things because they have to in war, and they come home and they don't have the support, and they have to band together as this, excuse me, I'm getting a little emotional, has said here, because the government has failed them, is just unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the member for putting this motion forward to have this discussion, because there's nothing worse than live with this by yourself.
Member for St. John South Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would also like to thank the honourable member on this side for putting this motion forward. The fact that we have to debate this shows that there is something wrong. The fact that the Conservative government was likely to vote against this motion shows that we have something absolutely, that we have something wrong. Hopefully they will vote for it, Mr. Speaker. Hopefully they won't vote against it, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Resuming debate.